patrons, and welcome to a lesson on creating and painting crystals. The first part of today's lesson is going to cover, as you can see here, I've got some crystals that I made from scratch out of a couple of different materials. I will ask my handy dandy video editor to go ahead and throw up the warning label here on the beginning of the video. Because we are going to be using knives and we're going to be using super glue. So if you are a younger person, younger painter, and you might want to ask for help with this, or if you're a patron and you feel like you also need, you're an adult but you need adult supervision with knives and super glue because you glue your fingers together, also recommended. So before we start off, you can see I have a couple of things. Laid out. I've got my paint, I've got my brushes, I've got my hobby knife, my super glue, I've got some pink foam, some polystyrene, and then some examples here of the things that I've created, of the crystals that I've created, and I've got smaller crystals and I've got larger crystals. So it should be a fun lesson. You can use this for making the little crystals on a base. They look more realistic. Miniature crystals, or the bigger crystals if you want some terrain. The materials I chose for creating my crystals were things that I had laying around. Probably a lot of you have this pink foam. I enjoy using it for terrain, and obviously as we're using it today to carve some crystals with my knife. I also have pieces of polystyrene. Polystyrene comes in a bunch of different sizes and shapes. This one's really small, so it works really well for the 28 millimeter little crystals I want to use if I were using on a base and kind of life size. So to get started, I'm gonna start off with the pink foam, and I think the pink foam is really handy. It cuts really well. I want to let you guys know that you need this is a box cutter. I have box cutters handy, and it's sharp. So thinking about your crystals, and if you guys want, of course, as I sound like a broken record by this point, always use references. So looking at some references for crystals, and you can kind of look at the shapes they make. So they make some shapes that are more, they're more geometric. So when I'm cutting, I'm not worried about, keeping things completely geometric, but I am thinking about, hard angles, especially when it comes down to painting them after we're done. I do want to note that I said super glue in the beginning. I used the super glue for the polystyrene. I use wood glue to glue these to anything because it is foam, and the super glue will eat away at this foam. So to get started, this part you will probably make a little bit of a mess. I'm gonna make a mess here as I'm cutting, but what I normally like to do is I have cut my pink foam into blocks, and I've got a couple different block sizes here. And what I do is I kind of start about halfway down, and I just cut off pieces as I go around. There's really no rhyme or reason. I'm just trying to keep it flat, so I went a little too far, but that's okay, you can fix it. Probably making the table shake, you can hear the table shake. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get this pink foam up to a point here. So I'm actually going to zoom out a little bit so we have a little bit more room to work and I don't go out of focus as much. So you can see I've got some nice planes on that as I go. And I'm just trying to work this up into a point. It's sort of like how in elementary school when you used to go in, well, at least I did, when you're bored, sharpen your pencil with something sharp. Instead of the pencil sharpener, you could cut it. So you see, I got a nice crystal on that. And then what I want to do is make sure I'm in focus. But with this, I would probably cut this some here. Because if you do look at crystals, a lot of crystals have a kind of a square base to them. If you start to look at clusters of crystals. So I would trim this up, and this edge is kind of, for me, it's a little unnatural, but the pink foam is really pliable, and I'm going to be careful not to cut myself. That's a, you know, no blood for the blood gods here. So you can see how easy it is. Just kind of think about these crystal forms, these crystalline forms, and carve them up that quickly with a box cutter or a blade. So I have that one, and you can see I've made a nice big mess. And then I have another one I can do the same thing with. Now that I've had a little practice at this, I actually feel like I'm getting better results with my crystal making here. So good. That's a nice looking carved crystal too. I think these are great. Obviously these would be great for bigger terrain, and I've made a mess. But yeah, you guys can kind of get the idea of how easy it is. Of how easy it is to carve these out of this pink foam and get some really nice results. The other thing I want to point out is that with this foam, this I didn't cover with wood glue. So for this piece I painted, that's got pink foam on it now. For this piece I painted up before I filmed the video. I didn't coat it with wood glue, but that's something you could do with the pink foam, and it helps seal the pink foam, and you might not get as much of that texture, which I personally like the texture on the rock. It makes it look a little bit more, you know, realistic. So you can certainly brush some wood glue onto these and let them dry, and then cover them up with primer, and that helps get rid of some of this, you know, some of the issues you have with the pink foam. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the polystyrene, and you can see I still have this large piece of polystyrene. I find that it's a lot easier to go ahead and carve up the polystyrene where I can have a really good grip on it and kind of keep it further away from my fingers so I don't nick my fingers. And as you can see, it makes for some really nice results. I just glued them down here in little clusters or just single little pieces of crystal, and it's the same idea. Of you don't need as much blade. I'm gonna lock my blade. The same idea of carving this little bit down to a point. So this takes a little longer because the polystyrene is a little bit of a harder material. but it's fun. It's like whittling. And once I feel it's adequately enough, kind of like a crystal form there, then I will cut it. If you want to, you can cut it at an angle with my snips I've got here, with my plastic snips. So you can cut it at an angle and glue it onto the base. That's what I do. I usually cut it angles like, 45-degree angles, slightly less than that, and then just completely, horizontal here. And it's just as simple as that. And I've made a little crystal. It's itty bitty, but it looks really good on a base next to a miniature. So there you go. Larger crystals and itty bitty crystals. Just kind of an easy introduction to terrain making there, on things you can make with pink foam and polystyrene. And now we'll go on to painting crystals. Now we're going to paint the crystals that we just carved out of pink foam. I decided I'm going to go ahead and paint this one. It's a little bigger than the little tiny ones, but the idea is still the same, with the little tiny crystals and the big crystals. As you can see here, I have my example piece that I painted up, obviously, before we were filming, because you can see I do have some blue paint left over on my hands. And so for this, I just have some beat up brushes that I'm using, a handful of colors. I'm going to go from darker to lighter to even lighter, and then I'm probably going to throw in just a little bit of color. I didn't do that on this, but just a little bit of color to break up all that blue, and just something that's kind of make it more visually interesting. If you look at references of crystals, a lot of times you get the light, think about the way the light is hitting, and if it's colored crystals, they seem to have more of the darker is up near the top, and some planes, depending on where your sunlight is coming in, some planes are very dark, or some planes and angles are completely a light color. So that's something to think about, and to not have little bits of polystyrene all over your miniatures. But after you've carved them, I apologize for anything left over there. But back to where I was with color, thinking about the planes, the angles, the way the light is hitting. And with that, with the colored crystals, obviously you're going to have darker areas, lighter areas, and then I also pick out all of these hard edges with a very light white, just to kind of give it the definition and make it look more like it's a crystal, like it's got this shiny reflection on the edges here. In today's video, I will be using Reaper Nightmare Black, Surf Aqua, Linen White. For some contrast color, I'm going to be using Witchcraft Purple. As you can see, my brushes have seen better days. A lot of times I use my older brushes that have been beat up and don't necessarily hold a point to them anymore for things like this, where I do terrain painting, or I'm going to be not dry brushing per se, but I'm going to be kind of beating up the brushes a little bit more than I normally would, working a little faster to put down my paint. And just in general, I don't need the precise brushes, besides this itty bitty one, for those lines. You can see that I've base coated the entire crystal as usual. I start from the darkest color and I'm going to work my way up. As I go along, I'm going to go back in and add color. I'm also going to be pretty quick about painting this up. I feel that it's fairly easy. One of the things you want to think about is, like I said just a little bit ago, is I'm going to focus on some of my colors being either completely light colored, some dark color up here, and then the general rule of thumb with crystals when you look at references, they don't have pieces of cat fur on them. And then also that near the base is usually darker. I believe that's due to the fact that they are the ground kind of keeps their natural color, whatever they're attached to. It's darker. So think about the crystal as more in the middle. In this area, you're going to have more of the light coming in and kind of refracting inside that crystal. And that's what we're going to try to capture as we paint it. You can apply this thought and this thinking to gemstones as well. I think crystals are a little bit easier to paint as they just have these nice edges and things like that. So I'm going to start. And like I said before, I'm not really concerned about, you see I just kind of throw the paint in there. And this is why I use an older brush. I'm going to make this whole area here, it's going to go up to a lighter color. But I'm really kind of focusing kind of in the middle here with my colors. And my brush doesn't have a fine point. My brush has a terrible point, but that works really well to give me that texture. And when I do want to kind of focus an area, I use the side of my brush to get in there and paint in that edge. I think this is a great exercise if any of you are practicing layering. This is kind of a great thing to practice some layering. Or even some wet blending. For me, my paint stays wet enough that I'm able to blend. I also kind of get the top of the crystal here. We're going to paint that white because it comes to a point. But still working in kind of that middle color. It's very quick. Obviously I don't want, some places I want them to stay really dark, but some places I might take it to the mid-tone. For me, this is just really relaxing because you don't really have to think. You can just go ahead and slap some paint. Doesn't have to be perfect. I'm going to switch to a smaller brush. And if you look at reference photos, there's some really nice, I just Googled, painted crystals. That's a lot of times I Google things in painted. And I also use the real life references in photos. But people painting them kind of give them some really neat texture in the middle here, as you can see. I'm kind of using my brush. It's so humid here that my paint stays wet for a fairly long time. So I'm able to kind of blend and do some pseudo wet blending there. Okay, now that I've brought up some of these angles and these planes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my very little brush and I'm going to bring up some of the edges with some edge highlighting, my very tiny brush, and you can see that it's not exactly white because I only want to go to that linen white in some places. And I'm just going to use my brush to kind of run it along these edges here. Not all the way in some places. Kind of, I fade out there. I definitely have more here. Fade out there. But just kind of finding all of these hard edges. And in some places, if I go outside of that edge, it's okay. Near the top, I will go almost white. And then I blend that in a little bit. That was too much of a harsh white light for me. Basically, I stop and I look at it every so often. And I say, you know, is it starting to look more like a crystal? And to me, it is. And I'm going to go back and add in some lighter blue too after I do this edge highlighting. And then also my purple. So now I'm going to brighten it up even more, but in smaller and smaller areas. And I might come back in, I might think places are too dark, so I bring up those areas. This is where it's, you know, all about the give and the take, bringing something up a little bit more, especially now that it's having a little bit of time to dry, and I can bring up those colors. And you can see why I told you to use a brush that you are not as attached to anymore, because it really is, I'm just smashing my brush here into the material. And now I'm bringing in some of those brighter highlights. And to break up a little bit of all that blue, I'm going to come in with some of my purple just to make it more interesting. We've done this in things before. Just to add a little bit of some color kind of in the shadows, just to make the subject a little bit more interesting, just to give it a little bit more color. And same thing with this one. If I were to take this one and just very quickly add in a little bit of purple here and there, it just makes it that much more interesting. And you can use, I enjoy, you know, purples. Green would be kind of cool here, adding in some green. Just that idea of breaking up all the blue. All right, thanks so much for joining us in this lesson. I hope that it was helpful and it gives you somewhere to start with, maybe making some really neat terrain or making some little crystals that are 28 millimeter. Obviously the stuff's a little bigger right here, but hopefully this helps and kind of lets you think about painting gemstones and painting crystals. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, feel free to chime in on our Discord, and happy painting!